to stop more people coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is good.
I think we'll go with that then. Okay, now, unfortunately, back when we got to the solar panel about plants, I did not time myself well. And so at the end of that lecture, I still had 18 slides that I think are kind of important left. So I have elected to use up the first 10 minutes or so of this lecture today on those 18 slides. So I've added them into the PowerPoint. So they're there, and they're also back in the old one for the solar panels. So you don't have to do anything except that intellectually, I'm going back and taking the last few slides from the solar panel thing before we start on the Arctic, okay? Now, we left off at the point where I said that there are plants who live in the deep shade who, when the sunfleck goes over their leaves, as the one you see here, turn on and frantically photosynthesize and get a great deal from that little sunrise, sunfleck. But when the shade is on that leaf, it does almost nothing. So it gets very little photosynthesis done. Then when the shade moves on, or the other option is that it does fairly well photosynthesizing in the shade, but when the sunlight hits it, it turns it off. Because otherwise it will burn up, literally, by running the photosynthetic machinery way too fast than it's capable of doing. So these are two different ways that a plant can deal with fragmented sunlight in the understory. That's where we stopped. Now, another plant that we were looking at quickly at the very end is this one, which has the old leaves here, mature leaves in the shade, and then the new leaves that are being produced, as you can see, are red. And that's a very common phenomenon for the bright new leaves of a plant to be red or blue or white or some other non-green color. That's pigment put in by the plant as effectively sunscreen to protect the new machinery being developed inside of those new leaves. So once there's chlorophyll in there, then this pigment is greatly reduced. It's still there, does other functions, but it's not the functional piece of the leaf like the green chlorophyll is once the chlorophyll is there. But before the chlorophyll is there, it has to have sunscreen. Now here's another aspect of sun and shade leaves. This is one individual plant in this photograph. But by accident, the way it's positioned on the corner of a building, this piece over here on the right-hand side of the canopy is in full sunlight. And this piece on the left over here is in the shade of the building. It's the same exact plant, but look at the leaves. All jumbled up together, all small, the wind blows through this thing. Look at these, all oriented in the same plane, each one large and dealing with shade. So effectively, this is what you get in the understory of the forest, and this is what you get in the canopy of the forest from the same species, the same individual plant. Now, look at the width of these leaves and think about the grass in your lawn in front of your house or on the street. This is a grass plant growing in the shade of the forest. And what it does is it invents shade leaves instead of those very thin leaves you're used to for grass plants growing in the sun. So this doesn't look like a grass, but in fact, this is just as much a grass as the grass in your lawn, different species, of course. This tree, very large tree, as you can see here, smaller trees down here below. You look up at it and you see all that green. None of the green belongs to the tree. All of that are epiphytic plants growing on the tree. And they are, in fact, leafy, doing their thing, while the tree itself has dumped its regular leaves and will now grow a new crop. But this is to emphasize that when you look at a tropical forest and you see all these green canopies, a lot of that green in the canopy does not belong to the tree. It belongs to a vine or to an epiphyte that's growing on the tree. It's not a and then there may be parasites as well. This is an orchid. This is one of those epiphytes. And here the leaf that you see and think of as a leaf is this one right here. That's fine. This fat thing down here is the food storage body, but it was green when it was younger and fresher, and that green was photosynthesizing well. In other words, the orchid stem was photosynthesizing, and the leaf was photosynthesizing. Both of them are epiphyllae. They sit on the plant and are not parasitic. These roots that you see here are holdfasts, and they pick up water and they pick up minerals from the dirt, but they're not parasitic. And there's a lot of plants like that. Here's another one. These are relatives of pineapples. These are all bromeliads, epiphytic on a tree branch. Now they are parasitic in the sense that they have weight. So the weight does cost the tree something because it has to make some tissue to sustain that weight. But it's not parasitic in the sense of drawing resources out of the tree. If we slice open one of those, you see here they are like that. Now we slice down through the middle. What you see is a leaf, but you see the junk accumulated here. And there's more junk accumulating here. This is filled with rainwater. There's some fermentation and decomposition here. And some of that minerals from that then are taken up by the leaf, not by the roots, by the leaf, who can take actually minerals from this into the leaf through the wax layer or through stomates in the wax layer. This was only recently discovered, well, 30 years ago discovered. This is a pineapple, a terrestrial bromeliad, and not an epiphyte. And, but you can see them in the supermarket. This is the top's just like that. And of course, here's the pineapple that you know down here. That's a terrestrial bromeliad. But this is Spanish moss. It's also a bromeliad. And if we get up close to this thing, it's not a moss. If you get up close to it, these are being blown out by the wind. They look like this. These are the individual leaves. These leaves are very, very proficient at extracting minerals from dust that falls on them along with rainwater. And they do photosynthesis as well, but you don't even see the green. What they're focused on is getting minerals out of the atmosphere. This is a very different use for a leaf. This is a plant that captures insects with the sticky stuff that you see on the outside here, these little tentacles. And here's an ant which has been caught. The leaf dissolves the ant, digests the ant on the surface, and gets the plant's nutrients from that. And these are very common in places where the soil is like ground glass and has virtually no mineral resources in it. So they're getting their goodies from the insects that they catch. This is a different way to do that. This is a pitcher plant where it takes the leaf that you see here, but it's modified into a trap. And inside the margin of the trap is polished and smooth so that if the ant walks not carefully around the margin here and gets on that slippery surface, it slips and falls in and gets digested in the bottom of this pit. Now, this is an aerial one up in the foliage itself. This is ones down here in the litter. So here's the forest floor litter with the dead leaves fallen. And here are some down here in the litter. And if we take and push the litter away so you can see the leaves, this is what they look like. Individual pictures. And then it has a piece of the leaf here. So this is a piece that's really just for photosynthesis. But this thing here is a mineral trapping device, a mineral trapping and an absorption device. And here's the litter inside of one of those. Not only is it got junk, dirt, and turds and leaf fragments, but here's a tadpole who lives in it. So this is one of these mutualistic relationships where the tadpole will be in here digesting the algae, eating the algae and digesting it, shitting it out in here, and then that's all part of the digestion process going on inside of this pitcher plant leaf. Now this is a really extreme case. These are leaves that don't look like leaves. They're three-dimensional up here on an epiphytic plant. And if we take and slice one of those open, this is inside of it. And the plant, what it's done is it's made a house, a domatia, like the swollen thorns on the acacias that the ants live in, and the ants bring in, here's a dead ant right here. The ants go out and bring dead insects, bits of dirt, all kinds of food material of all sort, and pile it inside of this thing. And then the tree grows its roots up along the stem and into the leaf to get its nutrients from this material. And right here is a seed that's germinated that the ants brought in and put in there, and it's white because it's in the dark, so there's no chlorophyll development. It's germinated inside, it will die inside, and that'll be more nutrients for the epiphytic plant, which is this thing here. And crazily, this plant right here is a close relative of milkweed, the thing you know around here with its big ordinary leaves. And here's the ant brood down here at the bottom from the ant colony who lives inside of this. So the ant colony is living mutualistically with this plant by bringing it food. And it's in an extremely resource poor environment in Malaysia. Okay, so now we leave that little cartoon to one side. And I used about 12 minutes on that. I don't know how to go. Anyway. Now, what I suggest is that for the Arctic lecture, I'm going to blast through it pretty quickly. And I suggest that you go to the website itself, which is in the yellow here, and look at these same images and click on them to get the text that's behind them, to get a more elaborate version of what's in that image than what I'm going to tell you as we go through it now, okay? So that's what I'm suggesting that you do. And when we get to the end, I'm going to point out that I won't get all the way through the images for the Arctic. There will be more on the website, which just for your own edification, they won't be on an exam or anything like that, but for your own edification, I suggest you go and look at them. Finally, along with the readings, there's just a few, there's also a folder of images that I purloined out of National Geographic. And they're all jumbled up together, but they're from one article. And I just want you to skim through those images and think about what you see in those images of the Arctic. Okay. Now, this is out of the plane window going up near Anchorage, Alaska. And this terrain that you see out in here is truly the closest thing to no man's land I can think of around here. There's just no people there. There's no trees. There's very little vegetation. Almost no other animals. There's no water that you can be fishing and getting seals or whales from. It's really a very, very desolate world. Out here is more normal. This is the flatlands that go out to the ocean. But the point being is there are pieces of the earth still who are extremely inaccessible. This is almost as bad as Antarctica is. And even Antarctica has got penguins all over it. So anyway, that's the sort of extreme example. And that's, of course, what everybody is concerned about today. This part of the world is melting. And you can see the glaciers. You see the H Valley here is full of a flat piece of ice. That piece of ice might be 20,000 years old, might be 30,000 years old, accumulated over the vegetation that used to be there. And that's, of course, what's melting now. So one of these glaciers running from, say, up in here all the way down to there could be retreating at the rate of 1 or 2 meters a year, or maybe even 3 or 4 meters a year. And that water, of course, is going in the ocean, and that's part of what's giving us sea level rise. Now, the flatlands, not the mountains so much, but the flatlands in the Arctics have a number of characteristics. The black you see here is one species of tree. So now this is the complete opposite of one of those tropical complicated places. Here we have a single species of tree making up most, if not all, of the vegetation. Along with it, in some special places, are poplar trees, which are a broadleaf tree that drops its leaves in the wintertime. We'll take a look at one of those in a moment. But the black spruce is really the dominant plant over the whole thing. The second thing is it's very flat. But you see how the river winds like this? That's a characteristic of a very flat area. And these oxbow lakes that you see here are where there was one bow that went out like this, and then a flood or something cut across the base of it, leaving this thing as a remnant. There's another one here, another one there. And these are the outcome of these loops in the floor on a very flat surface. Underneath all of this is permafrost. So this is floating. Everything you're seeing here is sitting on a layer of ice. Now, that ice is melting now, but here's just a couple of quick, this is the middle of the day. This slope right here is north facing. We're in northern Alaska now. In north facing, and even in the middle of the day, the sun does not hit it. That just shows you how much of an angle the sun is coming into the far Arctic, which means it's not going to heat up very much. But as it does heat up enough for there to be icicles. You see right here on the side, these little drips of water that are freezing. This is June, early July, that kind of thing. And that's the world that's being melted out now. This photograph is from 30 years ago. And so it could very well be, you couldn't take this picture anymore. But this mountain up here would still be getting no direct sun because it's too much of a north-facing slope. This is the same general area, but we're about a month further along. And now there's, of course, free water as well as blocks of ice. But the big point about this free water that had to be taken into account in the models is that this is black. So this absorbs heat from the sunlight. See, when it was all white, it reflects heat. The black absorbs it, and that absorbs it, warms the water, melts more ice, makes more black water, and pretty soon you get a feedback system there that gets rid of the ice entirely. 150 years ago, the big question was, how can a boat go from the Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the northern part of North America? Today, that's not the question of how can it, the question is how fast can it go? Because it has to dodge the ice, and it still has to worry about some places that might be temporarily frozen. But we're down to the point with climate change now to where practically there's an open water passage across the top, which of course then changes all the politics of Russia and Northern Europe and Canada and the United States, because now they all want access in a variety of ways to that open water channel. So the climate change per se, the fact that it's just getting a little warmer, isn't really what bothers people. It's the economic and sociological implications of that really bother people. Now, if we get on a land area that's got, well, this valley's already had its glacier melted out of it. And so we have dirt here like this, and then one of those meandering rivers down here through the bottom. And when you look at, there is vegetation. This is not the result of humans clearing the forest or anything like that. This is the natural vegetation that we're seeing here. And we look at a transect like this. You could also, of course, look at a transect from a river up to a ridge in the tropics. And you can count the plants and look at the plants and think about the things that live with them on that same transect from down at the river all the way up to the ridge. The big difference between this photograph and that photograph in the tropics would be that most of the species of plants, and probably the insects as well, that occur in this entire transect from the river to the top of the ridge are the same species everywhere. What happens is the proportions of them change. So one would be very common down here, another very common here, another very common here, another very common here. But they all, individuals of all of them are everywhere. Okay? If this was in the tropics, you have much more narrow bands of where each species occurs going up this slope. And many times, a species that occurs in one band right here does not occur anywhere else on the entire gradient. And if it does, it may well be a waif, a lost individual, meaning that some animal ate the fruit, got the seed inside of it, flew up to the ridge, defecated the seed here. One plant grew, but it doesn't reproduce because there's no other plants of that species to pollinate it. in the vicinity. So it's there might be one there, but it isn't doing anything. It's effectively dead. Whereas its breeding population is in one little narrow strip right down here. And that strip would be much, much wider elevation-wise in the Arctic. This is what that looks like close up. What you're seeing is one species of grass everywhere, and then a few broadleaf plants mixed in underneath the grass. This grass will be perennial. This is not something that seeds in every year, and the plants underneath will be perennial. Here they are again with less grass and more perennial plants here. So each of these plants that you see here could be 10, 15, 20, 100 years old. We're not dealing with even though it's very small, very low, it's not a dynamic community that's turning over very fast. Whereas if this was a disturbed place by people, or actually even more temperate, further towards the tropics or in the tropics, it could be easily turning over every year. So here's a single plant in there with its one flower open, and you can see there's whatever it is, 8 or 10 buds might occur here. This plant right here could easily be 50 years old. And that's the total amount of reproduction that it can produce in 1 year. This is a willow. Now you all know willow bushes. They're bushes, they're 2 feet tall, 3 feet tall, maybe 10, 15 feet tall, depending on where you are, many, many species. This is a willow tree. It's all underground. The only thing you're seeing here are the inflorescences. So the flowers are stuck up above the ground, but the whole plant is really underground. And those are the flowers, and then these are the leaves. So here's a very old plant, and so this is the same thing we saw in Wyoming and the prairie, of things that are buried basically, and really what they're buried for is to be protected against big herbivores, which we'll get to one of them. Now, there are very few left now. We'll get to one of them in a bit. And also to be protected from the drying wind and the blowing ice crystals, which cut like sandpaper during the winter time. And right down at their level, so here's our plant right here, our old tree, if you like, with its flowers on its surface, is a single butterfly. And that butterfly walks from plant to plant to plant to get nectar. It does not fly. If it flies, it runs the risk of getting above what's called the boundary layer. So if you had a thermometer and you laid the thermometer right down in the air, right at the surface, the thermometer would give you a much warmer reading than it does 5 inches above the surface. So right at the surface is a layer of warm air, and that's what the plant's photosynthesizing in, and that's what the butterfly is surviving in. But notice that there's a big black circle right here, and that's a heat absorbing surface for the butterfly to pick up more heat in its body to use for all the things an insect uses for. In the same habitat is things like this caterpillar, which could easily be 2 or 3 years old, if not older, whereas a caterpillar this size develops in a month in Costa Rica. And what it has to do is grow a certain amount in the short summer of 2 months, maximum 3, and then build a temporary cocoon or nest for itself, and then just sit there all through the winter, basically frozen or absolutely dormant. And then when the summer comes again next year, it cranks up again and goes on, eats for a month or 2 months or 3 months, and then maybe it does the same thing again the next year. So what you're doing is taking a life cycle and dragging it out over a long period of time in the calendar sense. But of course, in a metabolic sense, it's probably doing as much work as the tropical caterpillar of the same size does. This is about 1 inch long here from there to there. Now here's that forest I mentioned, the black spruce forest. Now, contrast this in your mind with a tropical forest or even a Pennsylvania forest. You're looking out there and you're seeing only one species of plant. And the snow is about, in this photograph, the snow is about 2 feet deep, something like that. So the small plants, the lichens and other very small shrubs that are in this thing mixed in, they're completely under snow. And so they're in the complete shade. But these guys have got their crowns up there and they're photosynthesizing to some degree during the warm part of the year, the couple of months of the year. But that's what the vegetation looks like, a single species. So, you know, there's the analogy right there to humans. We are a single species. And one virus gets into us and it goes boom everywhere. And it could easily kill a huge number of people like the Black Plague did and like other diseases have done so because we are a monoculture. Well, the same thing can happen here. You can have a fungus or a virus or something like that get into this thing and just cause devastation over literally hundreds of thousands of square miles. Now this is the poplar tree that I mentioned before. Here's the black spruce up here on the ridge. And then here's a pure stand of poplar trees. All one species. Same thing. You could have a disease get in here and take everything out. It's like the chestnut that happened in the eastern United States. We got the chestnut fungus from Europe. And we had chestnut trees in huge numbers on the east coast of the United States. They're not there anymore at all, period. So that fungus got in and it just took the whole population out. And that same thing could happen here. But here, the point being, this is no diversity in this forest. You can see it is, it's a single species. Now, I think in the last couple of photographs, you might have thought about the fact that look at the way the shape of the tree crowns of the spruce. A cylinder like this. These are all cylinders, every one of them. Now, when you think about what tropical trees look like, they're a big ball on the top of a tree trunk, or they look like an umbrella if you're used to thinking of them, the ones that you see from National Geographic photographs from East Africa. Very exposed at the top, a big surface at the top. And like I say, like an umbrella or like a mushroom. These are tall cylinders. Now, why are they tall cylinders? Because at this time of year, when there's sunlight, the sun is walking all the way around the horizon. It's going all the way around you. So what you do is you put your solar panel up here as a cylinder. So everywhere the sun is, it's hitting some part of you. So in effect, you make a cylinder and the sunlight walks around you. You expose it on all sides. Whereas in the tropics, the sun is overhead all the time. So you make a flat surface for the tropics. So what you get is two totally different tree shapes in the tropics than you do from up here. This is midnight. Now this is the sun in its high point at midnight. At noon, it looks almost the same. So it's just going to go around you, around, around. And if you can't imagine how that happens when you live in the Arctic, just take an orange and a flashlight and go around the orange with a flashlight and see where the light changes on the surface of the orange. Now, in this world, there is one common rodent. It's called a lemming. This guy's about, you could hold him comfortably in your hand. They'd be about 4 inches long, something like that. And these guys are famous for occurring in very high numbers at some times in the Arctic. And when I was a child, I was grown up with the myth that they have huge numbers and then migrate into the sea and commit suicide. So the population goes back down again. And then after a while, after a number of years, it goes back up again and the same thing happens. Getting older, I learned that this was generated by Disney in a Disney film called Life of the Arctic. And what he did was, because these things do occur in large numbers, he went out and he paid Eskimo children $1 for every lemming they caught alive. And they brought large numbers of lemmings to a point on the top of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The camera was situated down below, looking up at the top of the cliff. And the kids were all instructed to release the lemmings and chase them off the cliff. So they all jumped into the ocean to drown. And that became the signature take in the Life of the Arctic film. So if you probably be able to find it on the web at some time. There's also one called Life in the Desert, which is equally faked. There's one Life with Wolverines, which is another, which is equally fake because it was a pet Wolverine throughout, so on. So the point being that a lot of these myths were created around these animals, and the lemming is the one that has the best down, because later on, serious scientists went after the ups and downs and discovered a very interesting kind of biology here. These guys, the lemmings, eat grass. They do not eat the broadleaf plants. They can't, they're too toxic, but they can eat grass. So what they do is they build up eating grass, and they eat the grass down to zero. I mean, they just clean it all out of the habitat. But in the process, the lemming density goes way up, and then it crashes out of starvation. So it goes way up, it crashes, and it takes about 4 years from peak to trough to peak. And that's the lemming, the famous lemming cycle. Well, these guys are highly edible, the lemmings are. So that means that the predators in the Arctic then cycle along with them. They go way up, they go way down, okay? The other thing, this is one of the predators. This is a, well, different names, weasel, stoat, ermine. This is the summer color of its fur, and this is the winter color of its fur over here. And this is a very famous animal because of the use of the white skins with the black tips to the tail in royalty. These are gowns from, I think, the 16th century in Europe in a museum. And the black tips that you see here are the black tips of the tail, and the white that you see here is the white coat. Now this guy is a predator, pure predator on lemmings. And this is what he looks like at the front, and that's what he looks like there. And notice these teeth, they look just like shark's teeth. Those are teeth for slicing, not for chewing. So what he does is it's just like a hyena or a lion or a leopard. He slices the food into pieces of meat and bone and bolts them down. And the striking thing about this is they don't reproduce in a year when the lemmings have crashed. But when the lemmings build way up, these guys can have as many as 10 or 12 offspring in one litter, like pigs when they have a large bamboo seed crop. This is the Arctic fox. This is the summer hare. This is one that is shedding its winter hair, and this is what the winter hair looks like over here. So in other words, this guy on the upper left can live in the pure snow. I mean, what he does is he digs down through the snow to catch lemmings, and he catches the seabirds and other kinds of things that happen to be there. But basically, he can gut it out through those 9 months of real winter. But this is what he looks like in the summer. He just drops all that fur, and here he is over here dropping it in order to get himself down to this situation here. Wolves do the same thing. The most northern wolves build up on the lemmings and then crash afterwards or migrate out. This is a wolf skull, and again, look at the molars on the molars. These are molars shaped just like shark's teeth. And again, it's a chopper. It's not a chewer. It's not somebody who masticates like you and I do their food. This is a snowy owl who lives on lemmings and other kinds of birds. But when the winter comes in and the snow gets real deep, the owls have a terrible time finding enough prey. And if they have built up on a lemming increase, and then the snow gets deep, where they end up doing is migrating south. So I met these first in Minnesota in northern United States when they were floating out of the Arctic because of the lack of food, because the population was very high. And what they did was go south, and then they feed on squirrels and rats and mice and all the other kinds of small mammals that are available. This is a Skua. It's a gull that's a specialized predator on lemmings, as well as other birds as well. But basically, it's a gull that's turned into a lemming predator. This is a Skua nest. And here are the owners of the nest here. But what you see is this stuff. All this little patch of grass is from the feces of these birds and the remains of lemming carcasses that have been left out here and therefore fertilized this otherwise fairly low nutrient content soil. So you can spot where the nest was, and it's built there year after year after year. So what you can do is you can see where the nest was, even if the birds aren't there, even if there's no nesting going on, by this patch of fertilized vegetation. This is the Arctic bunting looking down on a crack, but in this crack is her nest. And she's got a big wad of insects in her mouth parts. You can't really see them very well there, but these are the kids who are down there in the nest. And these are the midges that she has. And so think mosquitoes who do not bite. So she's collected huge numbers of midges because the pools of water left by the melting snow have got sufficiently high nutrients and no predators, or very few predators, such that the midge density, who is as a filter feeder, as larvae in those pools, can build up very high. And then they become bulk food for things like that Arctic bunting, who migrates to the north in order to make use of this food in a place that doesn't have many predators. And then goes back down south, but not all the way to the tropics, but rather to somewhere in the United States or somewhere in Canada to pass the long winter time. This is a sandpiper, does the same thing, goes way up there to nest and feed, molt, and then turn around and go back again. So what there used to be before we did all the hunting and other habitat destruction in the central temperate zones was where we eliminated a huge number of these birds. There used to be enormous numbers of these birds landing in the Arctic in the summertime, reproducing, molting when they can't fly, and having their kids on the insect density that was building up in these pools of water. And then from that point on, they left and split out of there and went back down to the south again. So that's the sandpiper doing that. And this is an eider duck, which I'm sure you've heard of, eider down. These guys nested in huge numbers, not anymore, but right in here, you can see a sort of a gray color. That's the feathers off the breast feathers off of this female duck, who's flightless at the moment because she's regrowing her feathers now. And so she just sits there banking on there not being any predators. So this is basically a free hamburger. And children were then employed to go out there and collect these breast feathers. And that's what eider down is. Real eider down is when you buy an eider down jacket or a sleeping bag or something like that. It was these breast feathers collected from the nests of eider ducks. And these are the nestlings from those things. And notice that there's a lot of nestlings in one place, and some teenage ones here, and then adults out here. This is all a group of eider ducks working together as one single creche, the same way that ostriches do in Africa, the same way that other animals do, where they pool their children so that if a predator takes one, it takes one, but there's safety in numbers. If you're just two of you or three of you, the predator may easily get all two or three of you. Whereas if you're part of a pool of bigger numbers, you are yourself as an individual safer. This is the champion. This is an Arctic tern who flies to the summer, in the summertime, all the way to the Arctic, and turns around at the end and flies all the way to the Antarctic, where it passes the Antarctic summer. So it makes a trip back and forth between two ends of the earth each year. And it's eating insects and small fish and things like that. But the point is that this time of year, which is relatively predator-free and quite food rich, is something worthwhile flying all the way from one end of the world to the other end of the world to get. Now, in this system, there used to be a large number of these things called muskox. Now, they're not a large number anymore. They've been heavily hunted for their meat, for their fur. But this is a pasture. This bleak-looking terrain right here is the home of these guys. And what they are is extremely, think of them as very, very woolly cows. And they're not near as domesticated and friendly as cows are. But you see there's a batch over here in a group. They've all got their rear ends back here, their head ends out here. And if there are any juveniles, the juveniles would be here in the center of this ring. So their way of defending themselves against wolves or presumably polar bears or even black bears, grizzly bears, would be, not a retract on the black bears, but grizzly bears would be to form a group like this. And they're very aggressive towards anybody who tries to break into that group, which, as I say, is where the kids would be, where the calves would be. This is the skull of one that I found in the middle of an area that supposedly the last one had been killed many years beforehand. Now, I don't know, of course, how many years old this skull is, but to me what it represented was the fact that you can put an animal's head down like this, and 5 years later in the Arctic, it's still there looking at you. Whereas if this was the Minnesota that I grew up in, the north central United States, that skull would be gone in a year, or maybe there might be a little remnant of some teeth after a year. But the point is the decomposition rate in the Arctic is very slow, for the obvious reason that everything goes into a freezer or a refrigerator during most of the year. Now, you all know about reindeer, or you've all heard about reindeer, as in the animals who dragged Santa's sleigh. This is a male, and that is a real reindeer. And the striking thing about them in the Arctic is that this guy spends the short period of time of the year, the 2 months, the 3 months of warm weather, eating like crazy. So he gets very fat, so it builds up a lot of weight, and then it starves. So basically for the snowy time of year, this thing is losing weight continually. And if the winter was another month or 6 weeks longer, it would die of starvation. In other words, it accumulates enough to make it through, because the food that it wants is buried underneath frozen, hard snow, and very hard to get to. It gets to some, it digs down to some. We'll get to that in just a moment. But the point being that it is one who lives on the balance of accumulating and then spending, accumulating and then spending. Now, notice that it's got the big antlers up here, and of course the males use those for fighting with each other. But down here are a bunch of antlers as well. And whatever are those for? It turns out that those are very important for crashing through the frozen surface of the snow. So what happens is you get a deep layer of snow and then a little bit of warmth, and it melts on the surface, and then that freezes into a hard ice layer. And to break through that, to get to the lichens and plants underneath it, it uses its front hooves, and it uses this like a little snow shovel here to help to dig down through, break through that ice. Now that's a male. There's a female. And she will develop these, that's in velvet still. This is still growing. These antlers are still growing. She will develop this area here for the same purpose. In other words, deer, normal deer, I mean other species of deer, sorry, other species of deer, the males have antlers, the females do not. Reindeer are peculiar because both sexes have got antlers, but the antlers aren't used by the female for fighting. The antlers are used by the female for breaking through that ice in the snow in the winter to get to some food during the winter, because she's doing the same thing that the male is doing, as is this youngster here. They're building up fat during the warm season, the warm months of the year, and then burning it out as they survive through the winter. So that's how they make it into the Arctic. In other words, this is the one member of the deer family, which are many species, which has been able to get up into the real Arctic. Now, this leads to kind of the human interaction here. One is, of course, is the Santa's reindeer concept, which obviously comes out of Europe somewhere. But when I was a kid, growing up, these were animal cracker boxes, and Winnie managed to find this for me on the web this morning. And when I was about ninth grade, I became incensed by the fact that the animal cracker box said reindeer, and this is clearly a North American white-tailed deer from the central United States. It is not a reindeer. So I got very upset and wrote the company that makes these boxes and told them that they were educating incorrectly millions of United States children to think that this deer right here was Santa's reindeer, and that was actually a reindeer. And the answer I got back with them was, millions of American children think that is a reindeer, so that is what it will be. That was the interaction between the commercial world And my childish naivete at that time. But here is the way it has been portrayed, and it was portrayed. In my childhood, all of Santa's sleighs had North American deer as their portrayed animals. Whereas today, I went and looked on Google and looked up animal crackers and looked up reindeer and sleighs, and they're all perfectly good. Caribou, this guy here. Now, there's the black spruce forest again, and there's one very prominent animal in this black spruce forest, and you can see his track right here. He's down here, and he suddenly ends in this white thing. Well, the white thing is a bird. There's the white thing. Now, it's about the size of a chicken. This is the winter plumage, and this is his summer plumage. So just like the weasel goes from brown to white, and the Arctic fox goes from brown to white, and there's a rabbit, a hare who goes from brown to white, well, the ptarmigan does as well. The snow is about 4 feet deep here. No insects, obviously. So I hop off the dog sled, and the guy whose sled it is and is driving the sled, it's got his shotgun there, which everybody carries a gun in the Arctic. And I said, can I get a chance to really see what that animal's doing? And I understand what is this guy eating out there in the middle of snowdrifts? There are no insects, there's no fruit, there's nothing like this. Well, so we shoot the bird, and this is the crop. Now remember, the bird has a mouth, and the food that goes in the mouth goes into a crop, like a bag on the bottom where your Adam's apple is. This is before the gizzard. So here we open it up, and what you see in here are the tips of branch tips that have new little green developing leaves in them. So these are the leaves that were developed last year and are going to expand next year. And so the ptarmigan has gone along and picking them off. So it's taking the buds off the tips of the branches. So that's what he's eating. That's the first thing that goes into the crop, and that's what he's going to eat. You spread them out like this. Here's all the little pieces. So these are the tips. So what he's found for food in that system are the tips of branches. And so he goes along and picks the individual ones off, just like he would pick up an insect. Now we go down to the gizzard. So this is the gizzard sliced open. All right. So now the food is gradually pushed from the pieces of it, little doses of it are pushed from the crop down into the gizzard, which has these huge muscles that you can see here on the outside. These very large muscles are for being able to knead that the contents. And the striking thing in the contents here is this fiber that you see here is, of course, the fiber from those branch tips. And here's the branch tips here, which are being ground up. But what are they being ground up with? You see these little quartz white pebbles? These are quartz, very, very hard pieces of rock. Not as hard as a diamond, of course, but they're think glass. And where did the ptarmigan, when there's 4 feet of snow out there, where did the ptarmigan get these little pieces of rocks? Because they get ground off against each other, as well as being ground against the plant material. And where he gets it is he goes to a cliff where the vertical cliff does not accumulate snow, but there'll be a little ledge on the cliff. And they land on the ledge and walk along the ledge, picking up little tiny pieces of rock that are fractured off the rock on the ledge. And that's where he gets the grinding material. So here's the gizzard that's going to grind up this wood material, this woody food, and it's using little rocks that it gets from the landscape for that purpose. Pigeons in Southeast Asia, in tropical rainforest, where little nice pieces of hard rock like this are extremely hard to find, have gone a totally different way to grind up food material like this. What they've evolved is in the wall of the gizzard are like volcanic bumps. So there'll be like a tooth sticking out of the wall and another one sticking out of the wall here, made of extremely hard, tough, skin-like material. So now when this thing is grinding with the muscles outside, it's using a piece of very, very hard resistant wall of the gizzard to substitute the same thing that these little stones do. And the different pigeons, if it's each one invented different shapes of these little grinding surfaces on the surface of the gizzard. And those different grinding shapes are related to which species of seeds and fruits and leaves they are specialized on. So that's a way of specializing on different kinds of food with your gizzard. So now we take the whole, here's the gizzard here. And from there goes the small intestine. The small intestine goes down here. Da, 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 da. So this just looks like yours does, just a line, a tube. And it gets suddenly to this point right there. That is where your appendix is attached. Now this bird in effect has two appendices. It's called a cecum. Each one is called a cecum. And there are, or CKAE at the end if you want to make it plural. And somehow magically, as this intestinal material is moving down the intestine, out of this material, the bird shunts into this pocket right here the pieces that take longer to digest. And so this is a compost heap of longer duration than is the compost heap, which is the intestine itself. So there's two of these now. And the striking thing is in the wintertime, when they're eating all that woody tissue, these become very elongate and long and large volume, as you see here. If we had shot this bird in, say, June or July, when he's eating tender leaves, insect parts, little berries and fruits, things like that, the two cecums right here will have shrunk way down into a much smaller and less volume surface. So it's sort of going on vacation, so to speak. And then in the wintertime, when the food and the diet changes, then this intestinal machinery changes as well in response to that diet. Now, the Arctic had the tropics. This is just south of Anchorage, driving along a highway. I look up and I see this big cliff. So here's the black spruce here. And then the permafrost is this piece underneath it, the frozen layer of peat, very, very old carbon, which of course everybody's worried about now, going into the atmosphere as it warms up. Because as it warms up, the fungi and bacteria begin to degrade this material, and all the carbon goes off as CO2, just ordinary respiration. Excuse me. And then there's the original deposit on top here. I don't know whether that's volcanic or ocean, but the black layers there are coal, C-O-A-L, full of fossilized palms, crocodiles, and all kinds of other tropical organisms. So if this place was the tropics at one time, where was the Arctic? Now, I don't have an answer to that question. I think it probably already there are answers to that question by people who know about those things. But for me, it's one of these very interesting questions. We often talk about how there are fossil tropical organisms from 100 million years ago, 150 million years ago, 200 million years ago in the Arctic or northern Canada. Yeah, okay, so at that time, where was the Arctic? Or was there no Arctic at all at that time? So if that's the case, then where was the hot place? Because if there was no Arctic at all, then there was probably some other place. Well, it depends on, again, I don't know how the balance goes, but that's a real question that I'm not able to answer, but it really struck me looking at that coal layer. Now, the tropics has its own Arctic. This is often forgotten by people who live up here and live close to the Arctic. This is Volcan Orizaba in Mexico, and it's 18,000 feet tall. And there's obviously a big lump of snow and permanent ice on the top of that volcano. And then there's the slopes, of course, going down from it. And where I'm standing here on the roadside taking this picture is obviously the tropics. This is southern Mexico. And so you look at the, you say, well, how analogous is this piece right here to the Arctic or the Antarctic for that matter, from a biological standpoint? You know, is this just a little cookie cutter piece out of the Arctic? Well, the first thing you notice right away is, of course, as I just said, little, it's very small compared to the Arctic. So the Arctic and the Antarctic are huge in terms of the size of the terrain, the size of the ecosystem in which animals can live and evolve and so on. So, I mean, that's the first thing. The second thing is this is not contiguous with anything. In other words, yes, there's a little patch of snow and ice right here, but it's not connected to the other patches of snow and ice in other parts of Mexico or in South America or in Europe or anything like it. So it's an island. Now, of course, the Arctic is an island also in some sort of big sense. So we'll talk about islands later, another lecture. But the point of it is that it is an isolated piece. And that gives you different properties than if it's a piece of a very, very large chunk that has species moving from one side to another side and different kinds of environmental circumstances in different places. So that's the second kind of way of thinking of it as different. The third thing is that the things that are around it, the things that can move into it or land in it or be transient in it are, of course, very close by. Whereas you see, if you want to go from the tropics to the Arctic, you've got to cross the United States. Long space. If you want to go from the tropics to Mount Orizaba on ice and snow, we're only talking about a few tens of kilometers. I mean, this is very short distance. I think where I'm right here is about 50 kilometers away from this thing. And so this, of course, has from a biological standpoint and from a wind currents and the temperature changes and all these are all very different dynamic than if you have to cross very large areas of in between in order to get to the snow and ice. Now, this is a photograph I took when I was in high school by putting my camera up against a pair of binoculars. I didn't have a telephoto lens in those days, but it's still adequate to show something, and that is that here's the tropics right here, roadside. We're closer, obviously, now to the volcano. And then right in here is a group of trees that are mixed, like a mixed forest would be in Pennsylvania or Indiana or Minnesota, of broadleaf plants and conifers. And as we get closer to the volcano, it becomes pure conifers, i.e. we're approaching the black spruce kind of circumstance. And when you get right up here like this, it'll be one species of conifer. And finally it gets to a point which is called the timberline, where there aren't any more trees at all. So you can have in this little short distance here, the whole transect going from Florida to Alaska in one little short distance like this. And what kind of, that has a big influence on the animals, the mountain lion or the coyote or whoever it is that circulates over this, and on the banding on the existence of insects and other plants and so on. That's a whole another dynamic than having the huge North America to play with. And then you finally get up to this area here, which each summer and winter fluctuates. In other words, the boundary that you see right here, I can't remember what month of the year, I guess it was probably March, but the problem is that what month of the year this was will determine whether that white layer extends down to here or melts back up to there or something. So this is a fluctuating boundary, just like the warm area in southern Alaska and northern Canada is a fluctuating boundary as well. Now, with climate change, what happens to this? Well, what we're seeing all over the world is basically with climate change, this is melting. So what we're losing is the things that live at the top of the sides. And if you are humans and you live here, what do you depend on mostly from this? You depend on meltwater coming off of the glaciers, coming off of the snow that accumulates each winter. you're depending on that. And so the flow of that liquid is going downhill, 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 downhill. You're getting less and less and less. So if you're in Bogota, Colombia, or if you're in Lima, Peru, or if you're in any one of the mountain, the human agriculture, urban areas downhill from the Andes in South America, you're looking at those melting glaciers up there in the mountains, not as some esoteric, pretty change in the environment that makes it warmer for tourists to go up the side of the hill, but rather as where is our water supply going to come from? Now that we're not getting the water supply that we had anticipated getting and have been getting and our ancestors got for a very, very long time. The other side of that coin is that as this snow melts, it's not replaced. Well, sure, in some year that you might get exceptional amounts of rainfall in the winter, so you might get exceptional accumulation of ice, but in general terms, because the climate change is warming the whole system here, as it's warming the system, that melting is going uphill and it doesn't basically retreat. So as it goes uphill and doesn't retreat, you lose more and more and more of this, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Well, you can do about it by stopping climate change, but the point is that there's nothing you can do about it directly. Now, in the areas of Costa Rica that I work in, you can have one side of the volcano or the mountains have much more water than the other side of the volcano. So what that ends up with is all kinds of displacement arguments, because of course the people on both sides of the volcano are depending on the water. So if you're on the side that has getting less water coming off of here, the warmer side of the volcano, then you think, oh, I'll just go around, I'll build an irrigation ditch or a water pipeline that goes around the volcano and brings the water from the other side around to me. But of course, that means less water goes to the people who live on the other side. So all of a sudden, the people who live on the other side, who are paying no attention at all to you and vice versa, are all suddenly in a conflict which they didn't have beforehand. And how much of this is happening in the Arctic in terms of where the fresh water is going? I'm not hearing, as the glaciers melt off the Arctic and off Greenland, I'm hearing much more concern about, will this make the sea level rise? Well, it definitely will. In other words, that water is going to go somewhere as the glaciers melt. And if you melt all the water off of Greenland, for example, you probably raise the global sea level about 8 meters. So think of that, 25 feet, let's put it that way. So as you can see, this is what makes the big social structures of the globe very concerned about that, far more concerned about that than they are about whether a village in the Arctic gets flooded from, gets a village in the Arctic has less water of one sort or another coming from the glacier. The big concern is, where's that water going to go? And now, if you live near that volcano, of course, near that glacier, you're going to get the 8 meter rise just like anybody in New York City is going to get the 8 meter rise. It's not going to be restricted to Germany or to the coast of Europe or to South America. It's going to hit everywhere. And right now, of course, there's a lot of indigenous people, villages living on, or small towns on the edges of the northern slopes on the northern part of the continent, which are they live on the edges because they're very dependent on water for their food resources. Whales, dolphins, seals, fish, that kind of aquatic world is where they get most of their food. Those villages are now being flooded. And so they basically have to move inland, but when they've got a very flat area, inland means a long distance. It doesn't mean 20 feet. And so they're very concerned, but they don't have the economic and political power that the people in the rest of the globe, not the rest of the globe, but in the big developed world countries of the world have to both deal with the climate change situation and to be impacted by it. What happens if you get an 8 meter sea level rise. Now, I'm going to stop because I'm sort of out of time here, but as I say here, what I would suggest you do is go back to that website on the first slide when we started talking about the solar panel, and go back to the remaining Arctic slides that are there, and especially, and also go on Canvas to that folder full of the slides plucked out of National Geographic of an Arctic situation of indigenous people living on the edge of the Arctic. And look through those pictures are very, very self-evident and don't require much talking, but they do require that you really look at them and think about what's in those images. So I would like to suggest that you do that for your own edification as well. And then there's a few short readings in the folder. So with that, I will stop unless there's anything that Ozan has thought about that I should do or something. We're about 10 minutes early. That's because I'm still having trouble planning how long these slides are going to take. But that's where I am at the present time.
Yeah,
So
for everyone's information, the link Dr. Jansen posted is posted on Canvas is the old website under the modules. So you can check it from there. And I don't think we have questions. Do we have any questions right now?
okay, vacation.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
There we go.